Hi, I'm Mandy Rispoli. I'm a professor of special education at the University of Virginia. And today I'll be talking with you about partnering with families to support caregiver-mediated intervention for students with autism. Caregivers, which are parents, families, other caregiving individuals, play a critical role in their child's development. Typically, developing children and their caregivers may be able to create learning opportunities with ease that require little, if any, external assistance. Yet, children with autism often require explicit instruction to develop social skills and communication skills. Such intentional and explicit instruction may not already be within caregivers' skill sets. Access to training to help caregivers implement interventions is also not equitable, with families in rural areas or from marginalized populations being less likely to access these supports. In addition, we know that children with autism experience challenges in transferring or generalizing what they've learned in one context to another context. So, for example, skills they're working on at school may not be demonstrated at home or in the community. Additionally, because there's not always great communication between schools and families might not be aware of the interventions being implemented with their child. And in some cases, families might be using practices at home that conflict with the interventions that are being implemented in school. All of this leads us to need to develop ways for supporting caregivers and families so that they can continue to support their child's development in ways that are meaningful and feasible for them. This means that we have to focus on collaboration, specifically between schools and families. When we think about families, it's important to think about family systems theory. So in family systems theory, everyone in the family is part of an interconnected system. What happens to one individual in the family affects everyone else within that family system. So you can think of this as sort of a drop of water in a pond. At the beginning, the ripples around that drop of water are very close to where the water was dropped. And then those ripples grow and grow and grow until eventually all areas of the pond have been affected by that one drop of water. That's the family system. So if we're going to support children with autism, we have to understand that they exist within a system within their family, and we need to be supporting the entire family. In order to have really good collaboration with families, there's some skills we have to have. One is role release. So taking our expert hat off and giving that expert hat to the family because they are the experts on their child. So understanding that everybody has knowledge to share and expertise to learn from. This also involves empowering families so they can be equal decision makers and make sure that their voice is heard regarding their priorities and goals for their child's education and what is feasible and acceptable for them to be able to do at home to support that education. It also means that professionals need to be careful not to take over those conversations, right? We want balanced turn taking so that we don't have one speaker dominating the meeting or the conversation, but instead giving space for everyone to share. And remembering again that this family-centered or family systems philosophy guides all of the work that we're doing. So when we talk about creating partnerships with families, we're talking about being intentional about promoting family involvement. So thinking about individual families and their strengths, just like we think about individual students and their strengths, empowering families with information that's accessible to them through different medium or language, being willing to compromise on what is important and how to actually achieve what's important to the family, examining our own selves with respect to our own learning history or our prejudices or our biases, reading and learning about the family's cultural background and their learning from them directly about their values and goals for their own child, and then finding ways to learn more about the community in which the family exists, right? So all of these are essential practices for us to be engaging in as professionals to create partnerships with families. Why are we partnering with families? Well, in addition to the family systems theory and knowing that we can't change the child's outcomes without also supporting the family, families are among the first people outside, we as interventionists are among the first people outside of the child's family, specifically in early childhood, to see and comment on the child's development. And so we have to learn from our family's expertise and their experiences and work together to develop a plan to support the child's development. Also, within early intervention, we have to have a pretty clear understanding of child development so that we can help the family to set goals that are achievable as well as important to them. One way that we can support families is through that diagnosis process. So if the family is coming to public school and they're accessing screening and evaluation, they may end up with one or more labels that qualifies their child for special education services. And so oftentimes we as professionals are some of the first folks that they engage with around this diagnosis. So we need to be thinking about being knowledgeable for different reactions families might have to receiving a diagnosis, have resources on hand to refer to families to support them through this new journey that they're on, and making it clear that only certain individuals can provide a specific diagnosis. So we as special education teachers do not diagnose, but we do provide care and instruction post-diagnosis and pre-diagnosis. And then helping to refer them to other professionals who can facilitate those very initial conversations. So we're supporting families right through diagnosis. As teachers, we need to be steady. We need to be consistent and we need to be available to families. Things like gentle words and encouragements, of course, are more effective than ultimatums, intimidation, or even making overly harsh predictions about what their child will or will not achieve, right? That's beyond the scope of our practice. And also understanding that families may need some time to process this news. Once the family is ready to take the next step and think about intervention and supporting their child's development, this provides another opportunity for us to collaborate with families. So we can help families find training programs that they might learn from, maybe with respect to advocacy for themselves or for their child, or understanding legal and ethical implications for disability and special education. It's really great for schools to be connected with other community resources that might be culturally aligned with the family's background and values and available to them. We want to have frequent communication that is two-way. So two-way communication where we're hearing from families and we're also communicating to families, of course, patients, and then finally sharing strategies, which is what we're going to talk about the most today. So when we think about family-centered practices, going back to that ripple in the pond, we're thinking about the family as a primary support system for children. We're thinking about ways to strengthen that family so that everybody can benefit and achieve optimal outcomes. That might involve helping families access resources. That might involve encouraging families to be engaged in the decision-making processes. And it absolutely involves respecting family diversity and offering as much flexibility as possible to allow their participation. It's also important to remind families of some of the promises that we make within education, such as confidentiality, such as all communication being private, and their rights and entitlements within IDEA. So when we think about collaboration with anybody, but especially families, we're thinking about kind of three essential elements. One is teaming, where we're coming together to work towards a common goal. And the common goal is to give this child the best life possible, right? That we have open and honest communication that's two-way, where not one person is always the speaker, but sometimes we're also the listener. And that through that communication, we can come together to jointly reflect on what's going well and to create paths for growth for the child, for the family, and for the school services. So when we think about giving families support and strategies to help their child, one approach that we can use is called caregiver-mediated intervention. Caregiver-mediated intervention just means that a caregiver is implementing the intervention. Caregiver-mediated intervention is cost-effective. It's usually non-intensive. We know that it can improve child outcomes to intervention, and it can help support generalization of those skills that are learned to the natural environment. Within caregiver-mediated intervention, caregivers can be taught and coached to implement lots of different things. Sometimes we might be focused on a specific practice, like a toilet training protocol. Other times we might be supporting families to implement more comprehensive, multi-component interventions. Oftentimes, caregiver-mediated interventions focus on language and social communication, social interaction, and challenging behavior reduction. That's because those are core features of autism that are also easy to address through natural, ongoing daily routines. When a school or a teacher wants to plan for caregiver-mediated intervention, there are some questions to ask. The first is what? What does the caregiver want to accomplish, right? So this is not our goals for the family. This is the family saying, this is what's important to us, and this is how we'd like to support our child. So what does the caregiver want to accomplish? The next question to ask is, when will the caregiver implement this intervention? So if the caregiver wants to support their child's use of augmentative and alternative communication strategies at home, so perhaps picture exchange, our next question is, well, when would you be interested in doing that, right? Is that during mealtime? Is that during weekends? Is that bedtime routine, morning routine, right? What is the sort of the context within which this intervention needs to be implemented? Because that will shape how we support and coach the family to use the strategies. The last set of questions are how questions. How frequently should this intervention occur? So if we're working on using pictures to communicate, how often per day do we want to be doing that or supporting that skill? How will the parent or caregiver evaluate what they have learned? How will the caregiver track their child's progress? And how can the caregiver help their child to generalize these new skills across routines, contexts, and environments? Caregiver-mediated intervention training can happen in lots of ways. So we can do caregiver training through groups. We can do caregiver training individually in a one-on-one context. We can travel to the home to support caregiver-mediated intervention training through home visits. We can invite the family to the school, and we can go into the community to train families. So there's lots of flexibility in designing how to support caregivers to implement interventions with their child. When we think about group training, these are usually manualized programs that schools can adopt or purchase. They often have scripts to be followed during the group sessions, and then specific homework or practice opportunities for the families to work on the skills and then bring that reflection back to the group. So we have instruction in the group, we go home and we practice, we think about how things went, and we share that at the next group. And there are a number of manualized programs that can be adopted by schools in this sense. We also know that caregiver-mediated intervention training can happen face-to-face, but it can also happen through telepractice or telehealth, right? So the use of electronic or digital media to help bring people together across distances. Regardless of the format, one of the key elements of instructing families is to use behavioral skills training. So behavioral skills training is one of the core features of training others to implement practices, whether they be teachers, peer professionals, or families. In behavioral skills training, we have 4 components. 1 is written and verbal instruction. 2 is modeling or showing what this practice looks like. 3 is an opportunity to practice through role play, and then to receive performance feedback on that practice. So those are the key ingredients that you will find across all the literature on caregiver-mediated intervention, whether it's in group, one-on-one, online, or face-to-face. These are the key pieces. When we think about written and verbal instruction, that might be We want to think about ways to make this content really accessible to families. So we want to think about reading level. We want to think about length of material. We want to think about how much time does the family have to really dive into this and then meet them where they are. So maybe it's a one-pager, maybe it's a checklist. If you're doing a longer program, maybe you're giving the family a workbook or a manual to follow along with. So our written and verbal instruction can really vary depending on how and what we're teaching the families. When we think about modeling, this is really where helping families see what these practices look like is important. So we can use video models. You can find these online. Maybe you have some, ideally, even of the child themselves implementing this or using this skill, or you implementing this practice in school. So video models are really helpful. You can also do live demonstrations through role play where you can pretend to be the learner or the caregiver. And then even live demonstrations with the child or the student themselves. So showing the caregiver, this is how we would teach X, Y, or Z. And then following that model, we went practice. So we can practice through role plays. That's usually the safest way to start. We can make mistakes, we can pause, we can try again. And then following that role play, we offer feedback. And we offer two types of feedback. One is supportive feedback. So this is what went well, or a really valiant attempt at trying something that was really difficult. And then also we provide constructive feedback. So things that might need to be changed or tried differently in the future. Behavioral skills training is really critical to giving people content that they can then learn to implement. But that key ingredient to then taking it and implementing it on their own with their child really comes down to ongoing support and feedback. And one of the best ways to provide ongoing support and feedback is through coaching. In coaching, we work with families to set goals, to build action plans to help them meet those goals, to help them think about how to create opportunities to practice these interventions at home within their daily routines. So we do not want to add more stress to caregivers' lives. We want instead to think about, what are you already doing with your child every day, and how might we infuse some of these strategies into your already existing routines? So we're trying to make life easier, not add one more thing to their list. In coaching, we also observe so that we can figure out what feedback needs to be provided, and then we support the caregivers to engage in their own self-reflection of their learning. One coaching model that has a lot of research support is called practice-based coaching. This was developed by Pat Snyder, Mary Louise Hemeter, and Lisa Fox in 2015. There are lots of iterations of practice-based coaching, but this is the model from the Anita Zucker Center at the University of Florida that we have followed in our research. And what you'll see here is that the outer band, that green band, says collaborative coaching partnership. And that partnership in this case is between the family and whoever is supporting the family. Maybe it's the teacher, maybe it's an early childhood specialist, maybe it's an autism specialist or a transition support person. So that collaborative coaching partnership is really key. That's where we work on building relationships, trust, and rapport. At the center of the practice-based coaching model is the effective teaching practice. And this is whatever intervention the caregiver has decided they want to learn. So this might be a focus intervention practice or a comprehensive approach to supporting their child. And then everything else we do focuses on that specific practice. So we work with the family to develop goals and action plans related to that practice. We help the family to conduct focused observations of their implementation of that practice at home. And we work with the family to reflect and provide feedback. Practice-based coaching is a cyclical process, meaning it can keep repeating, and all we do is plug in a different teaching practice at the center. It's also non-hierarchical, which means that we as professionals and the family are on equal footing. Everyone has expertise. We're all sharing expectations and contributing to the direction of this partnership. When we have worked with families using practice-based coaching, we've had to make some adaptations to the model. One is when we work in schools, oftentimes we ask teachers to self-monitor their own implementation. And when we work with families, taking data is just maybe not something that they're capable of doing, right? With all the other responsibilities that they have. And so we might be a little bit more flexible in how they self-monitor. Maybe it's more of a general feel. I felt like this went well, or gosh, I couldn't even get to that today, which tells me that this intervention might not be feasible for my family. Sometimes we can observe the family directly, and then we can share feedback through a rubric or a checklist. We can also use online platforms, like this is a platform called Torch, where the screenshot, where we can have additional coaching strategies for families that are maybe asynchronous, meaning that the family can go into this platform and access our coaching when it's convenient for them. And we can go in and leave comments for the family based on their videos of their use of these practices when it's convenient for us. So we've done strategies like video self-reflection, having the families watch the video of them using this practice and offer their own reflections. We've been able to tag moments in the video to say, hey, this was a really great demonstration of this skill, or what do you think you could have done here when the child did this? We can also have a whole library of models that we share with families so they can see lots of different examples of how to use this strategy. And maybe we offer other additional materials like a quick cheat sheet that they could put on the refrigerator for how to use these practices. So there's lots of technology available to help deliver coaching, particularly with a telehealth or remote format. What's critical across all of this is to meet families where they are, right? So finding out what is the family's strengths, what's their capacity right now for taking on something new, and how can we design a system of support that's meaningful and useful for them. This is an example of a video library we might share with the family, and you can find videos online, or maybe you have videos of the child that you can share with the family. What's important, regardless of how we do this, is that we have families setting goals for themselves, action steps, and that we're helping them track their progress to see if those goals are met, right? That's how we start to build in a cycle of learning, of growth, and of tracking progress that sometimes can be difficult to see. But when we measure it in a way that's more observable, we can actually see growth that we might have missed otherwise. Other things to think about when working with families. One is involving families in the planning of the intervention. So we don't want to just hand an intervention to the family and tell them, go ahead and do this, right? We don't know what their context is, how many kids are in the home, how many jobs people are working, what their schedule is like, right? And so an intervention that we hand them might be great in our classroom and completely inappropriate at home. Right? So involving families in the planning of selecting an intervention is going to lead us to helping them be more likely to implement that intervention at home, because the goals of the intervention align with the goals they have for their child, and because the intervention itself is more feasible in their home. We also want to support family motivation by helping the family to set goals of using the practice at home in between our coaching or meeting sessions. And finally, things are not going to work out all the time, right? We're going to run into roadblocks and barriers. And so engaging with families around problem solving so we can work through these things rather than sort of abandoning an intervention that may have great progress or promise for the child. So recently we published a study in the Journal of Behavioral Education where we used practice-based coaching delivered through telehealth to support families to implement functional communication training with their child at home. Functional communication training is a really powerful behavioral intervention where we learn what the child's communicating through their problem behavior, and we give them a new way to communicate that message. So we're honoring their voice and teaching them a more socially appropriate way to get their needs met. So what we did is we worked with caregivers of children who had just been diagnosed with autism or other developmental disabilities. We worked with them individually, so one family at a time. The families completed or viewed online modules. So we gave our written and verbal instruction on video online that they could access and watch. And then we met with them once a week for about 30 minutes for weekly coaching sessions. So we worked with 3 families. You can see the caregivers are at the top and the children are at the bottom. So these are young kids, right? Because this is shortly after diagnosis. Each of the children had challenging behavior and had different ways of communicating. Our online weekly modules focused on these 4 areas. So first was helping families look at behavior as communication. The second was leveraging strengths of children's visual processing through visual activity schedules and choice making. Third was functional communication training. And fourth is what we call differential reinforcement, which is giving more power to behaviors we want to see and less power to behaviors we don't want to see. So when we ask nicely for something, we're more likely to get it. We reinforce that. And if the child engages in challenging behavior, they get less reinforcement or no reinforcement. So we're just shifting the balance in how we respond to different behaviors. Before the study got started, one member of our team would check in with the family each week, remind them of how to use the technology, check in with them to see how they were doing emotionally, and providing any kind of general resources that we could to them. Then, once they started watching the modules, our coaching sessions became much more focused. So we would ask the caregivers first to reflect on their use of the practice since we last met. We would clarify the objectives and the strategies that we were using. We would discuss what's working and what's not working and engage in some problem solving. We provided supportive feedback as well as constructive feedback. And we created opportunities for them to think about how they could embed these interventions into routines so that they could have even more practice with their child. We always asked if they had questions and other resources that might be helpful for them as they continue to learn how to implement these strategies. And these are our results. So on the left, we have the caregiver's behavior, and on the right, we have the child's behavior. So if we focus on the graph on the left, on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we have sessions. Those are our observations. And on the y-axis or the vertical axis, we have the percent of the functional communication steps that the caregiver implemented correctly. Across the top, you'll see 2 words. One is baseline and one is practice-based coaching. Baseline is sort of our pre-test, right? So this was the family's use of the strategies before we started the caregiver training program. And then that hashed line, that hashed vertical line is when we started the caregiver training program for each caregiver. And that's where we started implementing the modules and the practice-based coaching. And what I want you to notice is that in baseline or that pre-test, the caregivers had a lot of variability or very low use of these behavior intervention strategies. But once we started the online modules and the weekly practice-based coaching, we see an immediate increase in the use of these practices. When we look over to the right, we have the child data. So on the x-axis, again, the sessions, the y-axis is the percentage of trials where a child engaged in this behavior. So the open triangles are challenging or problem behavior, and the closed circles are appropriate communication. And what you see in baseline generally is we have lots of triangles, right? So lots of challenging behavior. And then once the caregivers started implementing the intervention at home, we see a flip where challenging behavior decreases and appropriate communication increases. It took a little while for Asher to get the hang of things, but with coaching, the family was able to stick with it. And we saw a really nice flip where Asher is communicating appropriately and no longer needing to use challenging behavior. So some lessons learned. Helping families understand why this is helpful for them to learn how to implement interventions at home, how it can be feasible, and how it's not just one more thing to do is really critical. And that's where that partnership and collaboration comes into play. Sometimes the response effort for doing this work with a child is just not something a family can take on. And so understanding that families are not all ready to do this. And that maybe families might be ready and then something happens in their own life and they have to just take a pause, and being understanding of that is important. One of the things also that I think is really critical that we start to look at is caregiver well-being and caregiver isolation. So in caregiver-mediated intervention, we're focusing specifically on strategy use, right? But we're forgetting a little bit about the caregiver's own self in this puzzle. So how do we support caregivers so that they have enough fuel in their tank to be able to care for others, right? So how do we get the oxygen mask back on the caregiver before they put the mask on others around them? And I think that really comes through caregiver well-being and supporting caregivers to find other networks of support in their communities or through the school community. Finally, I'll just say that all of this can be very customizable. So you've seen that caregiver-mediated intervention can be taught in a variety of contexts, from group to individual, manualized to kind of teacher-created, face-to-face to online. So there's lots of really great space for folks to play around and individualize to make sure that it's a good fit for the families that you're working with. So in summary, understanding the lives of families is critical. Understanding that we have these kids in our school for a very short snapshot of their lives, and they are with their families the majority of the time. So we got to find ways to support families. In order to do that, we need to gain insight into the home context. We need to develop cultural competence. We have to be sensitive to the lives and challenges that families are facing. You know, when I have a hard day, I can go home and take a shower and relax, right? A family of a child with a significant disability doesn't always have that luxury. And remembering that as we support families is really important. Creating partnerships with families to offer a variety of ways for them to participate. So meeting families where they are and knowing that one size is not going to fit all. And then respecting the family's priorities and concerns. So caregiver-mediated intervention is only helpful if it's achieving goals that's important to the family, and if the way to achieving that goal is feasible and aligns with their values, right? So everything has to be kind of custom made with the family in that regard. Thank you so much, and I wish you all the best in partnering with families.